The year was 1864, and the air in Burke County, Georgia, was thick with the smoke of a dying cause. The Confederate war machine was faltering, and the relentless march of General William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army was a specter haunting the Southern psyche. It was in this atmosphere of impending collapse that a detachment from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, tasked with scouting and securing the countryside southwest of Waynesboro, came upon a plantation that seemed, at first glance, to have been abandoned. The Thornhill estate was a picture of faded grandeur. The whitewashed brick of the main house was stained and peeling, its 6 columns standing like weary sentinels. The fields, once vibrant with cotton, were now overgrown with weeds. An eerie silence hung over the property, broken only by the cawing of crows and the creak of a broken shutter swinging in the wind. Yet, there was a palpable sense of being watched. The unit's commander, Captain Samuel Reynolds, a veteran of Antietam and Gettysburg, was a man hardened by the horrors of war. But nothing could have prepared him for what his men discovered when they forced open the heavy iron-banded doors of the estate's basement. The stench that wafted out was a physical blow, a miasma of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair. In the near-total darkness, huddled together for warmth and comfort, were 23 children. Their ages ranged from toddlers barely able to walk to adolescents on the cusp of adulthood. As the soldiers' eyes adjusted to the gloom, they were struck by a bizarre and unsettling uniformity. Every single child shared a constellation of distinctive features: sharp, high cheekbones, pale, almost luminous green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with threads of gold, as if each had been touched by the same artist. They were malnourished, their clothes little more than rags, but their striking similarity was undeniable. They shrank away from the light, their green eyes wide with a terror that was deeply ingrained. The soldiers, these blue-clad liberators, were just another set of masters in a life defined by fear. It was the eldest among them, a girl of about 13 with a quiet, unsettling dignity, who finally spoke. Her voice was a hollow whisper that seemed to suck the air from the room. "The mistress says we are her legacy," she said, her gaze fixed on some distant, internal horror. "We cannot leave because we are her blood." The words, cryptic and chilling, were met with confusion, but as their meaning dawned on the battle-hardened men, a wave of nausea swept through them. Veteran soldiers who had seen limbs amputated without flinching, who had charged across fields littered with the dead, felt their stomachs turn. This was a different kind of evil, a perversion that struck at the very core of humanity. Captain Reynolds would later write in a confidential letter, buried deep in regimental archives for over a century. "We discovered at the Thornhill estate a depravity so profound it defies all Christian understanding. The mistress of the house, one Catherine Thornhill, appears to have implemented a systematic program of breeding among the enslaved, utilizing her own person to create a class of bondsmen tied to her by blood, thus ensuring, in her twisted logic, their perpetual servitude. The children, her own offspring, were found in a state of profound neglect and terror. The details are too grotesque to commit to an official report. I fear this is a chapter of our national sin that will forever remain in shadow." Local histories of Burke County, written in the decades that followed, would omit the Thornhill estate entirely. It was as if the plantation, its mistress, and the 23 children had been scrubbed from the record, a shameful secret too dark to acknowledge. But they did exist, and what Catherine Thornhill conceived and built in the 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops represents one of the most chilling and meticulously planned atrocities in American history. A Gothic horror of eugenics and absolute power hidden behind the genteel facade of a southern plantation. Part 1. A Widow's Desperate Calculus, 1847. The winter of 1847 was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. A brittle frost clung to the Georgia pines, and a wind that seemed to blow straight from the Arctic sliced across the tired red clay fields of the Thornhill estate. The cold mirrored the internal landscape of Catherine Danforth Thornhill as she stood by the freshly turned earth of her husband's grave. Jonathan Thornhill had not been a good man, nor a particularly capable one, but his death from a sudden winter fever had slammed a door on whatever precarious stability Catherine had known. At 28, she was a widow, dressed in the oppressive black of mourning, her striking features, the same high cheekbones and pale green eyes that would later mark her children, set in a mask of composed grief. Beneath the mask, however, was a seething cauldron of fear and fury. The estate she had inherited was not the prosperous inheritance she had been promised upon her marriage 9 years prior. Thornhill Estate was a dying entity. The 1,700 acres were exhausted from decades of single-crop cotton farming. The main house, a 2-story federal-style structure built in 1805, was showing its age. Paint peeling, roof leaking, a silent testament to Jonathan's neglect and his fondness for high-stakes card games in the taverns of Waynesboro. The debt was staggering. Creditors, smelling blood in the water, had already begun to circle. A month after the funeral, Catherine sat in the estate's dusty study, its shelves lined with legal tomes and ledgers that told a story of relentless decline. Across from her sat Ambrose Talbert, the family lawyer from Waynesboro, a man with the pinched face and weary eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime managing other people's misfortunes. "The options, Mrs. Thornhill, are unfortunately straightforward," Talbert said, his voice devoid of inflection. "We can sell the property and the remaining assets to settle the debts. You would be left with a small sum, enough perhaps for a modest life in Augusta under your father's roof. Alternatively, you can attempt to work the land yourself, though given the state of the soil, the depleted workforce, and the current market, I must advise against it. The odds of success are negligible." Catherine's hands, resting on the desk, clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. Returning to Augusta was not an option. It would mean admitting defeat, becoming a dependent in her father's house, the object of pity and whispered scorn. She, Catherine Danforth, whose lineage stretched back to the founding of Georgia, reduced to a spinster aunt in a back bedroom. The very thought was an insult to her pride. But Talbert was right. The traditional path was closed to her. The plantation system was a brutal machine that required constant fuel. More land, more slaves, more capital. She had none of these. The enslaved population, which had numbered 42 when Jonathan inherited the estate from his father in 1838, now stood at 31. 16 souls had been sold off over the previous 3 years to feed Jonathan's gambling habits. The remaining men, women, and children moved through their duties with a hollow-eyed resignation, knowing that more sales were inevitable. Fear was a tangible presence in the slave quarters, a low hum beneath the daily rhythms of life. It was in this state of desperate calculation, during a long sleepless night spent poring over the damning figures in the estate's ledgers by the flickering light of a single candle, that the idea came to her. It did not arrive as a flash of madness, but with the cold, inexorable logic of a mathematical proof. If she could not afford to purchase workers, she would create them, but not in the haphazard, opportunistic way that other plantations encouraged reproduction, offering a blanket or an extra ration of food for a healthy baby. No, her plan would be far more systematic, more controlled, more elegant. She would create a population of workers who were not just legally bound to the estate, but biologically tied to it. They would be her own descendants. They could never be sold away because they were her blood. They would, in her twisted reasoning, possess an instinctive genetic loyalty to the land and its mistress. They would be Thornhill in name and in essence. The plan was monstrous, a violation of nature, of God, of every tenet of the society she inhabited, even one built on the foundation of slavery. But to Catherine, shivering in the cold study, it was the only solution that preserved her power, her legacy, and her pride. She was still young, still fertile. She would select the strongest, healthiest men from among the enslaved and use them as breeding stock. Her children would be raised with a privileged status, knowing their parentage, instilled with a sense of duty to the estate that was their birthright. Within a generation, she could have a self-sustaining, ever-growing workforce, bound to her by the most unbreakable chains of all, those of blood. She began a new journal that very night. It was not a diary of feelings or reflections, but a ledger of a different kind. She called it her cultivation record. To protect herself, she wrote in a simple substitution cipher, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Children were seedlings. The selected men were rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. The pages soon filled with charts and diagrams that resembled breeding plans for prized livestock, because that, in her mind, was precisely what they were. Her first selection was a man named Isaac. He was 24, born on the plantation, and renowned for his physical strength and calm, steady temperament. He was married to a woman named Charity, and they had a young son. None of this mattered to Catherine. One evening in early March, after the other workers had retired to their quarters, she summoned him to the main house. What transpired in the master bedroom that night was a brutal transaction of power recorded in Catherine's journal with chilling detachment. First, planting completed with rootstock 1, Isaac, age 24. Weather clear and mild. Soil appears receptive. Anticipate harvest in December. She summoned him again a week later, and twice more before the month was out. By April, she was confident she was pregnant. She noted the success with the same dispassion she would use to record a successful cotton germination. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Part 2. The watchful air and the unraveling. The first person to sense the shift in Catherine's behavior was her 16-year-old stepson, Richard. He was Jonathan's son from his first marriage, a bookish, introspective boy who had never accepted Catherine as a replacement for the mother he had never known. He viewed her as an interloper, a merchant's daughter who had married his father for status. In turn, Catherine saw Richard as weak, sentimental, and an obstacle. He had once suggested, to her horror, that the enslaved workers should be taught to read. Richard noticed that Catherine had stopped her morning rides around the property. She claimed the spring heat was too much, though the weather was still mild. She took her meals in her room and dismissed the young house slave, Pearl, who usually attended her, preferring solitude. This withdrawal was entirely out of character for a woman as meticulously concerned with appearances as Catherine. His suspicions crystallized in early June. Hidden behind a tall bookcase in the estate's library, he overheard a conversation between Catherine and Miriam Grayson, the local midwife. Mrs. Grayson was a sharp-faced woman in her 50s, known throughout Burke County for her skill and, more importantly, her discretion. "Absolutely. You're certain of your condition, Mrs. Thornhill?" Mrs. Grayson's voice was clipped and professional. "Quite certain," Catherine replied, her tone even. "I should think sometime in early December." "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" There was a pause, heavy with unspoken calculation. "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Catherine lied smoothly, "shortly before his final illness." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. His father had been bedridden and delirious for the entire month of January, racked by the fever that eventually killed him. The idea that he had been capable of conjugal relations was ludicrous. The child Catherine was carrying had been conceived in March or April, with someone else. The scandal would be catastrophic. It would give the creditors all the ammunition they needed to seize the estate and destroy the Thornhill name forever. But a deeper, more visceral horror gripped him. Who was the father? He began to watch, his bookish nature lending itself to patient observation. It did not take him long to notice the pattern. Isaac was summoned to the main house with a regularity that was anything but random, always after dark, always when the overseer was away or occupied. Richard saw the way Catherine spoke to Isaac, not with kindness, but with a strange, clinical lack of the overt contempt she showed the others. By July, he was certain. The realization was like a physical blow. His stepmother had not just taken a lover. She had coldly chosen to conceive a child with an enslaved man and was planning to pass the child off as his father's legitimate heir. He found the key to understanding her true motives in early August. While Catherine was in Waynesboro, he picked the simple lock on her writing desk and discovered the cipher journal. Richard, with his affinity for puzzles, cracked the code in 3 days. What he read within those pages plunged him into a nightmare. This was not a simple case of adultery or desperation. It was a blueprint for atrocity. The charts, the calculations, the cold-blooded notes on genetic traits. It was a systematic breeding program with Catherine at its center. She wasn't just having a child with Isaac. She was planning a dynasty of human chattel, with herself as the matriarch. Trembling with rage and revulsion, Richard copied several pages of the journal, translating the cipher into plain English. This was his evidence. This could expose her, stop this madness before it went any further. That night at dinner, Catherine fixed him with her pale green eyes. "Richard, have you been in my study recently?" Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed. "No, ma'am," he lied, his throat constricting. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason," she continued, cutting her meat with precise, deliberate strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Everything. Without it, we are simply animals tearing at each other." She offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "I know you loved your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was unmistakable. If he acted, she would destroy him first, painting him as a disturbed, jealous boy inventing monstrous lies. Who would believe him? He was a minor with a known resentment toward his stepmother. She was Catherine Danforth Thornhill, from one of the oldest families in Georgia. Defeated, Richard burned the copied pages, but he kept watching, a silent, horrified witness. And then he began to feel unwell. It started with a profound fatigue that sleep could not cure. Then came the headaches, the loss of appetite, the muscle weakness, the stomach pains. Catherine displayed a cloying, suffocating concern. She insisted he stay in bed, personally preparing his meals, broths, soft foods, a special tonic she procured from a pharmacy in Augusta. Mrs. Grayson was summoned and diagnosed nervous exhaustion, possibly consumption. Richard, from his vast reading in the library, recognized the symptoms. They were textbook signs of arsenic poisoning. His stepmother wasn't just threatening him, she was slowly, methodically murdering him, disguising it as a tragic illness. He was trapped, too weak to escape, too isolated to seek help. The house servants were loyal to Catherine out of fear. The overseer was rarely near the main house. In a final, desperate act, he spent 3 days composing a letter to his grandfather, Theodore Danforth, in Augusta, detailing everything: the breeding program, the journal, the poisoning. He sealed it and gave it to Pearl, the young housemaid, begging her to post it in Waynesboro without telling Catherine. Pearl, terrified of the consequences of disobedience, gave the letter directly to the mistress. Catherine read it without a flicker of emotion, then burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard's helpless eyes. "You are very ill, darling," she said softly, almost tenderly, as she adjusted his pillows. "The fever is affecting your mind. You're imagining things that aren't real. It's a mercy, really, that you won't have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3rd, 1847, 3 weeks shy of his 17th birthday. The doctor from Waynesboro, summoned to certify the death, noted consumption as the cause and remarked on the tragic speed of the boy's decline. Catherine wore black and wept decorously at the funeral. 4 days later, she gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan, after her late husband, and claimed he was born prematurely. Few in Burke County dared to question the timeline aloud. Part 3. The System Solidifies, 1848 to 1856. The years that followed were a period of grim transformation for Thornhill Estate. To the outside world, it appeared that Catherine Thornhill was performing a minor miracle. The plantation, once teetering on the brink of ruin, began to stabilize. Cotton production, while never spectacular, became consistent enough to service the debts. The enslaved workforce mysteriously began to grow. Catherine earned a reputation as a shrewd, reclusive, but undeniably capable businesswoman. Behind the whitewashed walls and the screen of live oaks, however, a meticulously engineered hell was taking shape. Catherine gave birth to 4 more children between 1848 and 1853, daughters named Eleanor, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son, Samuel. Each birth was attended only by Miriam Grayson, who had become a crucial and well-compensated accomplice. The midwife received generous fees and a rent-free cottage on the edge of the property, a tangible reward for her silence and her services. Those services soon expanded beyond delivering Catherine's children. Mrs. Grayson became the enforcer of Catherine's genetic design. When enslaved women on the plantation became pregnant through relationships that Catherine had not sanctioned, for human affection and desire could not be entirely eradicated, it was Mrs. Grayson's task to rectify the situation. She administered potent, plant-based abortifacients in a small, grim room behind the overseer's cottage. These forced terminations were conducted with a clinical brutality, the physical and psychological trauma inflicted upon the women buried deep in a silence born of terror. One woman, Ruth, dared to resist. In the spring of 1851, she was 5 months pregnant with the child of a young field hand named Samuel, a man she loved. Catherine, discovering that the father was not the man she had designated for Ruth, ordered the pregnancy terminated. Ruth ran, making it nearly 4 miles into the dense pine forests before the overseer's dogs tracked her down. She was dragged back, held down by 2 men, and forced to ingest Mrs. Grayson's poisons. She survived the physical ordeal, but her spirit was broken. She worked like an automaton until a fever took her 2 years later. She was 24. By 1856, Catherine had 7 children of her own. They occupied a bizarre liminal space in the plantation's hierarchy. Legally, they were enslaved chattel, registered as such in the county records as children born to enslaved women. This legal fiction gave Catherine absolute ownership. In practice, they lived in or near the main house, wore decent clothes, ate well, and were given something infinitely more dangerous: an education. Catherine herself taught them to read and write, a crime punishable by law in Georgia, but she was confident in her isolation. She was grooming them, preparing them for their roles as the cornerstone of her legacy. Her eldest, Jonathan, was 8 years old in 1856. He was a quiet, serious child who bore a striking resemblance to his mother. He had no memory of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849. Catherine had found his presence a complicating factor once his primary purpose had been served. The money from his sale helped pay down the estate's debts. The other children knew nothing of their true parentage. They were told they were fortunate orphans, taken in by their benevolent mistress. Catherine's record-keeping became more elaborate. She constructed a windowless heritage room in the east wing of the mansion, a shrine to her project. Its shelves held her coded journals, now spanning multiple volumes. On a large table in the center, she drew intricate family trees, not of past lineage, but of future pairings. Lines connected names with notations: strong constitution, good teeth, compliant temperament. It was a human stud book. She also kept small glass vials, each containing a lock of hair from every child, a physical archive of her genetic material. The psychological landscape of the plantation was a complex web of resentment, fear, and complicity. The special children were resented by the other enslaved people for their privileges, yet pitied for what they were and what they represented. Everyone in the quarters understood, on some instinctual level, what Catherine was doing. They saw the measurements, the charts, the cold, appraising looks she gave the children. They knew a storm was brewing, that these children were being raised for a purpose more horrifying than field labor. The only potential external threat was Lawyer Talbot, but he was a pragmatist. Thornhill Estate was becoming profitable again, and profitable clients were to be nurtured, not questioned. The plantation's isolation, 7 miles from Waynesboro on a poor road, and Catherine's reclusive nature ensured that the secret remained contained. The system, monstrous as it was, functioned with a terrible efficiency. Part 4. The Gathering Storm, 1857 to 1863. The tensions of the late 1850s, which were tearing the nation apart, were a distant rumble to Catherine Thornhill. Her world was Thornhill Estate, and her focus was on the impending adolescence of her first brood. Jonathan was 11, Eleanor 10, Abigail 9. The breeding phase of her plan was approaching. It was during this period that the first major crack in her carefully constructed world appeared. Eleanor, the most perceptive and strong-willed of her daughters, discovered one of the cipher. Mother had given her, she painstakingly decoded its contents. The revelation was cataclysmic. The entry for her own conception. Second planting with rootstock 2, Thomas, age 21. Excellent physical specimen. Anticipate harvest in late October 1848. Shattered her identity. Thomas, the quiet, broken field hand who never met her eyes, was her father. Catherine was her mother. She was not a charity case. She was a planned product, a seedling. And the journals laid out her future, a planned pairing with a boy not yet born, her body destined to produce the next generation of Thornhill slaves. She confronted Catherine that night, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and devastation. "I read your journal. I know what you are. I know what I am." Catherine's face became a mask of cold stone. "You should not have done that, Eleanor. You're my mother. Thomas is my father, and you've been planning to breed us like animals." "Sit down," Catherine commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What followed was not a denial, but a chilling articulation of power. Catherine confirmed everything, speaking with a brutal pragmatism that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. "You will cooperate," Catherine concluded, "because the alternative is far worse. Right now, you live in this house. You eat good food. You wear decent clothes. You can read and write. What do you think happens if you refuse? I sell you. I sell you to a plantation where they work field hands to death in 5 years, where women are brutalized as a matter of course, where literacy earns you a whipping. Is that what you want?" Eleanor, crushed and terrified, acquiesced. But the knowledge was a poison seed that she carefully cultivated. She shared it with Jonathan and Abigail. Jonathan, so thoroughly indoctrinated, struggled to see the evil, arguing that Catherine was protecting them. But Abigail understood immediately. The older children now saw their mother for what she was, and the atmosphere in the main house shifted from one of controlled instruction to one of silent, simmering mutiny. Catherine sensed their defiance. In August 1863, she decided to make an example. A young enslaved woman named Grace, pregnant and desperate, tried to run away. She was caught, and the next morning, Catherine assembled the entire population of the estate in the yard. She forced everyone, including her own children, to watch as Grace was given 20 lashes. "This is what happens to those who try to leave," Catherine declared. The punishment backfired. Instead of cowing the population, it crystallized their hatred and revealed Catherine's own fear. Whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Eleanor, emboldened by despair, began secretly meeting with the women from the quarters in the woods at night. A woman named Hope, in her 40s, who had endured years of Catherine's tyranny, looked at Eleanor with a complex mix of pity and solidarity. "Your mama," Hope said quietly. "She thinks she made something special here. Thinks she made a family. But all she did was make people who hate her in ways she can't even understand." "What if we didn't wait for the war to end?" Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "What if we ended this ourselves?" The idea of rebellion, of patricide, of freedom taken by force hung in the air, electric and terrifying. It was the spark. But before they could act, external events forced Catherine's hand. Part 5. The Night the Devil Disappeared. March 1864. By March 1864, the Confederacy was crumbling. News filtered down to Burke County of Sherman's relentless advance. The enslaved population at Thornhill knew liberation was imminent. Catherine knew it, too, and the knowledge filled her with a frantic terror. Everything she had built for 16 years was about to be swept away. On the night of March 17th, she gathered her 11 biological children in the main house. The air was thick with impending doom. "Things are going to change," she told them, her voice unnervingly calm. "The Yankees may come. There may be attempts to take you away from me, to destroy our family. I cannot allow that to happen." She led them to the forbidden heritage room, illuminating her macabre museum of lineage. "This is our legacy," she proclaimed, a fanatical gleam in her eye. From a locked cabinet she produced a small wooden box containing bottles of laudanum. "This medicine provides eternal peace. It is the only way to protect you, to keep us together." Eleanor stared in horror. "You want to poison us?" "I want to save you," Catherine insisted, her composure beginning to crack. "If you are freed, where will you go? You belong nowhere. You are nothing without me. This way we stay together. We stay at Thornhill." It was Jonathan, the firstborn, the child she had groomed to be her heir, who finally broke. "No," he said, stepping between his mother and his siblings. "I read the journals. I know what you did. I know what you are. I am your mother." "You're a monster," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. The word, spoken aloud by her favored son, shattered the last of Catherine's control. She slapped him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. Seeing her children arrayed against her, united in their hatred, she made a final, desperate decision. If she could not preserve her children, she would preserve her legacy. She snatched up the journals, the charts, the vials of hair, clutching them to her chest like a talisman. "You think you can escape me? You think you can pretend this never happened? These records will survive. They'll prove what I built here." She burst from the room and fled the house, a spectral figure in her nightdress, running wildly toward the slave quarters. Jonathan and Eleanor gave chase, their shouts lost in the wind. What happened next became the buried heart of the Thornhill legend, a story that would be passed down in whispers but never confirmed. Catherine, screaming about her legacy, ran into the midst of the quarters where the enslaved population, roused by the commotion, had gathered. She was face to face with the people she had tormented, bred and broken for 16 years. She stood before them, clutching the physical proof of her crimes. And in that moment, the storm broke. There was no single leader, no coordinated plan. It was a collective eruption of a generation of suppressed rage. The people descended upon her. The journals were torn from her grasp, the pages scattered and trampled in the mud, the glass vials smashed. The evidence of her cultivation was destroyed before her eyes, and then they turned on the cultivator herself. The details of her death were never formally recorded. The stories told in hushed tones years later suggested it was quick, a blow to the head with a piece of firewood, perhaps, a just and summary execution. Her body was dragged away and hidden, most likely dropped down an old dry well or buried in an unmarked grave deep in the woods. When Jonathan and Eleanor reached the quarters, they found a scene of controlled chaos. Hope stood facing them, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "Where is she?" Jonathan demanded. "Gone," Hope replied flatly. "That's all you need to know. She's gone and she ain't coming back." "What did you do to her?" "What she had coming," Hope said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Now you got a choice, boy. You can raise hell about your mama, or you can understand that justice got done here tonight and let it rest." Jonathan looked at Eleanor. In his sister's eyes he saw not horror, but a grim, terrible resolution. They had both wished for their mother's death. Now it was a reality. To protest would be to betray the very people she had victimized, the people who included their own fathers. "Let it rest," Eleanor whispered. They turned and walked back to the main house, leaving their mother's body to the justice of the people she had owned. Part 6. The Aftermath and the Silence. The next morning, Catherine Thornhill was officially missing. The overseer, old Silas Kendrick, searched half-heartedly. The sheriff from Waynesboro investigated and concluded she had likely fled the approaching Union Army. It was a convenient and believable explanation. The case was closed. 14 months later, Captain Reynolds and his men would find the 23 children, Catherine's own and the first products of her sanctioned pairings, locked in the basement. A final desperate act by the overseer, or perhaps by the children themselves, who feared the outside world as much as they had feared their mother. In the years following emancipation, Thornhill Estate crumbled. The freed men and women, with a few exceptions, scattered to the winds, seeking to put the nightmare behind them. Jonathan tried unsuccessfully to farm the land before drifting west to Texas, where he died a broken man, his possessions including a notebook with the repeated phrase, "I did not choose this." Eleanor moved to Savannah, became a seamstress, married, and never had children. She never spoke of Thornhill. The estate itself decayed. The main house burned in 1871. That same year, a well driller on a neighboring property broke into an old cistern on the former Thornhill land and discovered a skeleton. The coroner recorded it as an unknown female, victim of blunt force trauma, and buried it in an unmarked grave. The black community of Burke County knew exactly who it was. The story of the night the devil mistress disappeared became part of their oral history, a dark folk tale of righteous vengeance. Captain Reynolds's confidential letter was filed away and forgotten. Local historians, whether out of shame, disbelief, or a desire to protect the county's reputation, expunged Thornhill from their records. The 23 children, with their distinctive green eyes and auburn hair, were absorbed into the population of freed slaves, their lineages dissolving into the great, anonymous stream of American history. Epilogue: The Buried Truth. The story of Catherine Thornhill is more than a tale of Southern Gothic horror. It is a stark allegory of the logic of slavery pushed to its most extreme and perverse conclusion. In a system that treated human beings as property, Catherine simply took the next step. She decided to become the architect of that property, to control not just their labor, but their very bloodlines. Her breeding program was a precursor to the eugenics movements that would arise decades later, a chilling demonstration of how easily human life can be devalued in the name of efficiency, legacy, and control. The Thornhill estate was a laboratory of human misery, and its mistress was a scientist without ethics, a mother without mercy. The silence that followed, the unmarked grave, the buried military report, the omitted county histories, speaks volumes. It was a silence enforced not by the powerful, but by the powerless, who had finally seized a measure of justice and chose to protect it. They carried the truth with them, a heavy burden and a sacred trust, ensuring that while Catherine Thornhill's name might be forgotten, the memory of her crimes and the resilience of those who survived her would not be entirely erased. The red clay fields of Burke County have long since reclaimed the Thornhill estate, but if you know where to look, you can still find the foundation of the main house, a ghostly rectangle in the soil. And if you listen closely on a quiet evening, you might just hear the whispers, not of the mistress who tried to build a legacy in blood, but of the children she locked in the dark, and the people who finally and forever set themselves free.